Okay, thank you for having me, and I'll start right away. I'm a geographer and global historian. I'm actually an independent researcher, although I'm affiliated at two universities, the Africa Research Institute and the Jagiellonian Research Center for Global Social Studies. And we recently founded the Prime Minister Nagy Research Group about understanding the life history of Hungarian Prime Minister Ferenc Nagy. And I'd like to invite all of you to join or follow our work in the Decolonizing Eastern Europe group, which is on Facebook and Twitter. My presentation is about Hungary and Ghana, which I've been occupied with this topic since 2016 as part of the two research projects. First, the 1989 after 1989, which was about understanding the global history of the system change of 1989, which focused mostly on Eastern Europe, and the second was Socialism Goes Global, which was about understanding socialist globalization. And both were connected to the University of Exeter and led by Professor James Mark. And these projects led me to try to understand the relations, or perhaps forgotten relations, between Eastern Europe and the global South, or we could say Third World, depending on what terminology we try to stick to. So my argument is, what would the 1960s, specifically these forgotten relations, and it's also a question, why have these been forgotten, tell us about this new southern opening after 2015, when Hungarian government started this geopolitical and foreign policy strategy of opening to the south, which includes Ghana, of course. My approach is a world systemic and post-colonial approach, so I'll be focusing on coloniality. A world systemic in the sense that I understand the world economy as hierarchical, with there is a core and a periphery, and in between, according to Wallerstein and others, there's a semi-periphery. And I try to understand our Hungarian position in the world economy as a semi-peripheral one, and I try to understand these relations, evolving relations between the semi-peripheries and peripheries of the global economy, which often are allied with the interest, or in the interest to somehow contest Western, or in this analytic terminology, the hegemony of the core, of the global core. So I will focus on global historical understanding of our histories. So not just bilateral relations, but about how to contextualize these relations in not just socialist globalization, but wider global context, entanglements, interconnections, circulations, and also the translations between positions and interests. I'll talk about this forgetting of these relations later. But okay, to go further, these, like the first three books in the front, in the top, they're all about understanding this wider global history of Eastern Europe, and I'm specifically these connections to the Third World. Now let's turn first to why Ghana became important in global history, but of course in my story. So Ghana was the first sub-Saharan Africa country to become independent in 1957, and it was a huge promise of development, of also of contesting Western dependency. And President Nkrumah's nationalization policy of forging a sort of united nation in Africa was kind of interesting and contradictory, but it was also focused on an industrialization plan, electrification via the various dam projects, but most notably the Akosombo Dam on the Volta River, which resulted in this huge lake, artificial lake Volta, which you can see on the map. And there was huge dependency on US and UK companies and loans. For example, the Kaiser Company, which was a US-Canadian company. The economic stakes was that most of the economy relied on cocoa production So monolithic production and export-oriented economy, non-diverse, there was price dependency, and there was a general need for trained staff for state planning. But this project was also connected, and Nkrumah was also entangled in wider visions of African futures and development, of Pan-Africanism and the evolving non-aligned movement. And here I'd like just to point out these very forgotten Hungarian connections to both concepts and movements. For example, William Du Bois, who later settled in Ghana, kept some relations with Hungarian writers, and also his works were translated in the later on in the socialist period in Hungary. So this reception of these works of Pan-Africanism also connected to Ghana are a very interesting topic, I think. So what was this Hungarian opening, and why was Socialist Hungary opening to Ghana? So it was an immense change that after the Second World War, Hungarian relations could develop to a country that was formerly dominated by an imperial Western core country. In this case, mostly the British Empire. Before Hungarians tried to open, so the first opening ups in the 1950s were to Egypt. There were also some development relations to Indonesia. But before, so during Stalin, it was not, the political situation was not set to set forth coordinated foreign policy. But this changed after the 1956 revolution, where the state socialist regime, later on led by János Kádár, strongly focused on opening up to legitimate internationally the socialist regime, but also for various political economic reasons. So this was part of the Khrushchev turn of opening up. And that's when this battle between the two world systems became very acute. There's a forgotten autonomy of these small countries. There was not that much dependence on Moscow as often anticipated by others in literature. So the first connection developed in 1958, first trade and diplomatic relations, and even the first foreign trade booklets and translations. This early turn of Africa started in the 1950s. So Hungary recognizes the Republic of Ghana as independent state in 1960, and later on, you can see the building of the embassy of Ghana in Budapest, and also there was an opening of the Hungarian embassy in Accra, Ghana. But the turning point was actually Ghanaian President Kwame Nkrumah's Eastern European round trip, where he also visited Hungary. Now, this is where I'd like to focus a bit more on the role of Eastern European states for Ghana. So developing context was about levering Western dependencies. And for Eastern European states, this comparative advantage of being small states who could maneuver more easily in the global economy, who could persuade who were more persuasive to these post-colonial countries than the imperial Moscow. These weak actors, in the terminology of Lukáš Stanek, an architectural historian who wrote the book Architecture in Global Socialism, was really about attaining a good bargaining position. So there was also this turn towards African socialism by Nkrumah was about levering dependency and becoming more flexible in the global scene to open the country up for various influences. So Ghana became a transnational hub of various knowledges and influences, and tried to make something out of that as an advantage. So there was a signing of the first big joint statements to establish not just diplomatic relations, but cultural, economic, technological, and educational bilateral agreements. There was huge coverage, but what's really important is the post-colonial parallels. That Hungarian regime argued that we also lived for centuries under semi-colonial subordination. In fact, under the war, German fascists ruined and looted Hungary, said János Kádár. So there was this Western anti-Western, anti-colonialism of the social states was used as a global ideology to foster alliances. But what's also very important is that Krumah met this development economist called József Bognár. József Bognár was a chief, a very forgotten figure, an important figure in Hungarian history, who focused on this category of poorly developed or developing countries as a separate type of economic development, in order to maneuver between these rigid socialist and capitalist development categories and to come up and experiment with new ideas of economic development. And József Bognár's work at this time, which was at this moment focused on Hungarian development, caught the eye of Krumah, who invited him to develop the first 7-year development plan of Ghana, which they did in 1962. So there were also others like Tamás Bácskai, who was really importantly connected to African development from this point. But Hungarians were just learning this and using their expertise, which actually was accumulated during the interwar era. So the interwar era economics, state planning, and also various planning expertise, as we could see later on, hydroengineering, for example, or agricultural planning, developed at this time and was used after the late 1950s to be exported to African countries and to more widely to Afro-Asian countries. So Bognár became a pivotal figure in this process. So another thing about this this plan is that it was actually a transnational product. So there were many economic advisors. Bognár even held a conference in Legon in 1963 to discuss the plan with Western and also other African and Asian development economists. Think of Samir Amin, for example, who passed away quite recently, was also involved. And his plan was a moderate, balanced agricultural development plan to balance this, to counter this imbalance of this very export-oriented and monolithic economy. Now, Nkrumah later on overruled this 70-year development plan by a very ambitious industrialization policy. So actually, it was not really applied. Although I've gathered all the relevant materials in Ghana, in archives in Accra, and also in Hungary in the archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Okay, so who was Bognár and why was this whole thing important? He was a development economist. Importantly, he was formerly a part of the member of the Smallholders Party. So therefore, you could see this agriculture focus in his work and this influence. He was mayor of Budapest in 1947 and a member of Communist Party, but only until 1956 due to the revolution. He did not hold any political positions later on, but he focused on research and also he became a very important foreign policy advisor of János Kádár. Actually, this Ghana job led to the development or establishment of the Center for Afro-Asian Research in 1970. Also the director of the Institute of Cultural Relations for several years. And my thesis is, which I found in materials, is that this experience in developing Ghana led to importing ideas into the new economic mechanism in 1968 about export-oriented development. So these ideas, so this sort of periphery of Ghana for the Hungarians served as an experimental ground to come up with semi-capitalist ideas of development, which they could apply in their own economies. But what was also interesting that there was a clash of colonialism at this time. So actually the state socialists or communists were racing to counter the political refugees, Hungarian political refugees. In this case, former Prime Minister Ferenc Nagy, who also from the 1950s on promoted this idea of Soviet colonialism to persuade the same countries, the same Afro-Asian, later on non-aligned bloc. So they were actually catching up in the 1960s to counter these arguments with their anti-colonialist agendas. So you could see Bognar's huge book, which summarized these ideas, and he was later on invited to various other countries in the Afrasian region. But they also were very important. Bognar's team was important in supporting information and backing or briefing the first Hungarian government delegation to Africa, which was led by Gyula Kálai. And Gyula Kálai was the first deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers from 1960 and 65, and he was very important in fostering these relations between Hungary and African countries. Now, I won't go into details to this trip. I have a lot of materials on this. There was also a documentary film, a reportage, 4 weeks in Africa on this trip. So this gave huge political legitimation for Bognar's project. As I said, the Center for Afrasian Research became a government think tank with various non-economist backgrounds. Experts were involved, and there were propositions for Hungarian export-oriented development, which fueled into the new economic mechanism. There were also various other experts involved, mostly in hydro engineering, Gyula Joankai or Emil Mosonyi, who were in the United Nations FAO project, but also Charles Poloni, the noted architect, or like music teachers like Frigyes Rónai, who founded a music department in Ghana, or also journalists like György Kalmár, who wrote very important books on writing about Ghana's development. So the periphery became a center for various for the fusion of various ideas, but also important stepping stone or like an important way or an important gateway to open up to Western Africa and also to the wider Africa. So that's why Ghana was important for the Hungarians. But the private archives and personal memories are also important because of how they influence today. And these are largely unprocessed. There's one example, the aquabiologist Béla Enz, whose son Boldizsár Enz is today the honorary at the Consulate General of the Republic of Ghana. So you could see how these relations and this knowledge, these experiences are really important to reprocess.
Sorry, sir, 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So Hungarians used this connection to promote their trade. And for example, at the Ghana International Trade Fair in Accra, you could see an advertisement and about some architecture. Advertisement of the Hungarian Trade Exhibition in 1962. And you could see these were the dominant companies who tried to position themselves and export their products. What was interesting is that these were mostly fine machinery, electronics, textile goods, pharmaceutics, and also there was an important strand of Hungarian geologists and engineers working in prospecting and working on feasibility studies. The Aluterven chemical complex was very important from the 1960s. Many of these projects of like having bus companies planted in bus factories planted in Ghana, for example, or lamp factories were unsuccessful due to the recession in the 1970s. But some projects like the feasibility studies in geology were quite successful throughout the 1970s. In fact, Hungary tried to gain a global role in this through Ghanaian work. Just a short graph on the right, you could see Ipartev planning company share of exports from its total income. There was a peak of 37% in the 1970s. So by the 1970s, Hungary really pushed on this export orientation in some of these companies, planning companies, gather foreign currency. And also they tried to use it to gain diplomatic advantages. I won't go into the details of students and things, but they were also used very importantly. building of their contacts were very important as they were turned into developing investment opportunities. So lastly, this opening to the South from 2015 and how is a new start is a very interesting question if we look at this rich history in the 1960s. The Hungarian embassy was closed in 1987, and during the 1980s, there was a global debt crisis, which resulted in the disruption of our relations with countries in the global South. Most of the embassies in Africa were closed. There was a return to Europe after 1989, so it was actually a late coming of throughout the 2010s to return back to these countries. So actually, what the government is doing now is returning back to those contexts which we developed during the socialist era, which is a bit contradictory in the political sense that socialist internationalism is usually treated as an ideological, era when all of our foreign connections to these countries were based or controlled by either Moscow or by ideological interests, which I tried to show that it was not really the case. So there was a new embassy established in Hungary and Africa strategy accepted. And what I'd like to argue here is that the new bilateral agreements also now on economic, technical, education, diplomatic agreements focus on very similar export products and very similar industries that were developed in the 1960s as export industries or export products, which is very much connected to our semi-peripheral structural position in the world economy, because we exported industries through which we could compete with the West. Think of training, education. Think of electronics. There was also textiles involved previously, but the similar export strategy exists now than in the past. Difference, although, is that in the global ideology of how Hungary tries to position itself is through, for example, Christian ideology. So I also have this argument that Christian ideology is used as a new global ideology to foster and gain alliances and contacts in this region, which kind of substitutes the former anti-colonialist socialist internationalism. This is an example of Hungary Helps, which is a state aid organization. Okay, and right now there were high-profile Hungarian delegations quite recently of István Jakab and also Hungarian President János Áder. So one was a parliamentary delegation and one was a visit by the president. They also focused on promoting agrotechnology and and education, and so the similar, as I said, similar export industries that were used in the past. So what I would like to conclude, and sorry for rushing through all this, is that we have to think about the politics of history of the technical, economic, and political reasons for forgetting this past. The technical is the unprocessed archival materials. The economic is the reasons for disengaging with this region due to the 1980 debt crisis, and the political is the anti-communist sentiment of our government and of the 1989 system change. As I said, these relations were part of this kind of socialist internationalism. So what I would argue for is that we need to understand this shifting global ideologies aligning to shifting economic positions, but we are just maintaining our semi-peripheral strategies of integrating into the world economy. And again, these countries are used from and are approached from this position. So we should perhaps exploit the resources and networks set out by our shared past. And here I just want to point out the role of cultural diplomacy, as it is not really emphasized in today's foreign policy and the work at the Hungarian embassies. This is an argument which was made in the previous sessions today. So thank you very much for your attention.
Well, sir, thank you very much for you. Your presentation was fantastic, and I see you put a lot of time and effort into your presentation. And I'm certain, much as I appreciate it. Now, the rest of the audience does as well. Thank you very, very much. It was a very good presentation. I really enjoyed it.